Thank you for sharing your views. The next question, what comes into my mind is how do you perceive expansion in the private sector?
That's a great question, Amit. Primarily and for India. When we contrast ourselves with countries like the US or Canada or the EU or even Australia, our biggest advantage, I should say, is the immense potential for growth in energy need. You know, when you look at Western countries, there is a lot of turf war going on and actions being taken to protect the turfs of the traditional utilities, primarily because energy growth is not being observed there. There is a decline in energy usage. Whereas when you look at a country like India, I think we are probably, among the top few globally in terms of annual energy, right? Um, Now, with that being the case, a private sector has the huge potential to bring in technology and enable our leap into the new energy paradigm that we are going to experience over the next, I keep saying next 50 to 100 years, because that is where we should be setting our vision right now. And so specifically where private sectors could play a role is bringing in the much needed capital infusion to upgrade the infrastructure. Because what I see happening today is piecemeal and a band-aid approach of trying to improve the infrastructure based on how the infrastructure was built 100 years ago. The same construct and the same framework is being used. However, I would posit that we need to forget looking at the last 100 years and how business was done over the last 100 years, and we need to actually have a probably, for lack of a better term, a dreamt up vision of a fully renewable energy powered grid, and try to see what is the framework that is going to be needed to make sure that it is a win-win situation for the traditional utilities and new infrastructure investors and new technology investors, right? And then try to see, okay, now how do we overlay the renewable energy producers? The producers might be, individual rooftop owners like you and I, or it could just be, any industrial, commercial, corporate body, or even large-scale megawatt plants, right? So private sector, I think, can have an immense impact on this and be an enabler rather than something that needs to be kept away, by the discoms.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Dinesh, this now one more thing. Globally, we see there are a lot of things happening onto the policy side. If I have to ask that in India, what do you expect from the policymakers for our industry to expand or to grow?
Let me share a little bit of perspective before I start with this as a prelude to answering this question.
Please.
I think, historically speaking, we had a big change in the political party that was in power at the federal level in India in 2014. And when the new government structure came, they actually held a lot of promising thought process in terms of, what structures of the legacy systems, needed to be improved, or even, supported. And, an example of a legacy system that was supported in a big way is the Life Insurance Corporation of India. When they looked at that organization, the government did not see any need to revamp or restructure that organization. They supported that. However, the same government actually saw the need to revitalize, restructure, and change the framework under which the discoms were traditionally been operating. And they brought in new programs to recapitalize, to write off the bad debts of traditional utilities. That was in 2014. And it was very crisp and clear in the minds of the administrators back then that the fix needed to be on how these utilities were being managed and how their finances were being managed and so on and so forth. However, as recently as late 2020, what you'd see is the same political party continues to be in power. However, I think now they've come to own the problem. So in a way, I think psychologically, and the reason I'm saying this is because it is not the issue of technology or technicality or economics or so on. I think it's a fundamental shift in the psychological view of the political leadership. They've been in power for 6 years. They have not been able to change or improve or dramatically restructure the traditional utilities. And I think now they're in a situation where they see that they might be now part of the problem. And so what has happened is, as opposed to a policy view that saw the need to restructure the utilities and change the framework and so on, now we basically, I think, are at a situation where the political leadership has started to toe the lines of the traditional utilities. And the biggest proof of that pudding was when the federal government came up with the amendment to the Energy Act, where they basically said, anything above and beyond 10 kilowatt solar will be gross metering,
Right, right.
which in a way went to fit right in with the narrative by the discoms that the root of all evil of the financial distress of utilities laid on, new world approaches like distributed energy, like rooftop solar. And this is my prelude to the question. Okay, and the reason I say this is very important. The fact pattern of how the utilities are being operated, the fact pattern of how the finances are being managed, none of that has changed. But I think somehow psychologically, the political leadership has become or complacent, or I think they've taken responsibility for what has become of these discoms. And I'm worried about this trend for a simple reason that the political leadership might now start more and more playing along with the narrative of the legacy utilities and discoms. Now, this being said, right, what can or what should the government policies be focusing on? Energy democracy, I think, is what the policy makers can use to ensure India definitely leapfrogs in the energy sector. And for us to grow as a country, whether it is going to be becoming an export hub for technology and manufacturing and so on, energy is needed. And to enable our younger population to enjoy some minimal benefits of comfortable lifestyle needs energy. And what the RE sector across the board has enabled is energy that is now comparable to energy from traditional sources, right? So I think policy should be very supportive. And I think the fear of standing up and trying to walk from the comfort of having crawled, will not go away by reminiscing on how comfortable the crawling was. I think it can only come by looking at the benefits of walking and running. And so that being said, I hope and I strongly urge that the policymakers do look into the future and enable policies of energy democracy so that new players, everybody can come in and play. I'm not saying kill the utilities, kill the discoms. I'm saying let's not look at the past 100 years and try to restrict rules and regulations so that we can continue to live like how we did 100 years ago. So that's my response to your question.
Change is the name of the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Dinesh, so, what according to you would be one thing, which would be way forward? If we have to say that as per Dinesh, this should be something which is way forward to our industry. What would you suggest?
Um, I think that policy enablement is the key. And within that policy enabling functions or features that the government could play, I would not point out to things like subsidizing anything, right? Rather, what I would suggest is create a level playing field that completely tears up our existing and archaic tariff structure and
Mm,
come up with a comprehensive ground up new tariff structure that is going to carry us forward into the next 50 to 100 years. Now what does that tariff structure look like? That tariff structure is probably going to be something that recognizes the sensitivity of time of use and time of generation, right? And then, that tariff structure is going to be something that creates a common use infrastructure or recognizes transmission and distribution assets as common use infrastructure that is not hoarded by somebody or locked out or used to lock out new energy producers. And I think that tariff structure should again take into account how much do people really lean on the grid or how independent are they off the grid, right? So I think tariff structure is probably going to be the biggest levelizer. And for a country like India, we definitely need to take into account the health impacts into the tariff structure. If I'm producing 1 kilowatt hour of energy from the traditional coal-based power plant, for example, the average in India, I think, is probably about 1.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere if we produce 1 kilowatt hour of energy from coal, right? Now, a comprehensive study needs to be done about not just the fact that it is getting emitted, 1.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide is getting emitted, but to actually look at the health impact of that. How many cases of asthma do we incrementally contribute to? And if there is an asthmatic citizen, to what extent are we going to burden our healthcare system, be it in the rural areas or in urban areas? And what does that contribute in a negative way to lost, GDP from having a citizen that cannot participate in a productive way in the economy, right? So
true.
I think it is the tariff structure that I would say is at the root of making it work for everybody and a win-win for everybody, right? So I would leave it as the main and critical item that is going to be an enabler for us.
So tariff structure which comes out of the policymakers table. In fact, wouldn't you want more of private players inducted in while the policies are being made? We need to
Exactly.
have a mix of private and government representatives while the policies are being made, because it's just not a single-handed game, right?
Yeah, it is, and as I stated to my response previously, right? I hope that, and I wish that our policy makers don't become captive
True.
to the views of the utilities and the discoms. How many times in a year do the policymakers, listen or have the opportunity to get the audience of the utilities and discoms? Every day, probably, right? Now, how many times when you compare that with how many times in a year do the policy leaders get to hear from the views of the private players, the public, and the community benefit groups and so on? I think it's very sparse, right? So there is a natural tendency of, I should say, bias, where the utilities, the policymakers keep hearing from 100 utilities from across the countries on a daily basis, and they're all singing the same song. And then pretty soon you see that even subconsciously, the policymakers start to sing the same tune, right? That could
True,
be the
true.
disaster for us and for our future as well. So yes, any tariff restructuring definitely needs to have huge participation from across the community, across the country, and to ensure, and even the academic side, right, to ensure that we are bringing in the the main driver for this infrastructure and the tariff restructure has to be a complete relook of how the grid is going to be 100 years from now, right? That is the starting point. And for that, you need visionaries, you need people that can really envision how we can have a future and to achieve 100% renewable energy, for example, right? Maybe the answer is not 100%. I think it goes back to how, as a country, we came from a 10 megawatt target on an annual basis to, now we are talking hundreds of gigawatts, right?
Yeah.
It's the same. We start by imagining a world where it is 100% renewable. Maybe we don't get there, but I think getting to 50% is a huge achievement too, right?
True that. True that.
So that's how I would put it.
At least there's a vision for that.